Major development just dropped. After days of deliberate silence, Nolan's friends have suddenly resurfaced in the public eye, and what they're now revealing about his mysterious death is far from ordinary. This development carries real significance. They've pursued aggressive legal action, including a private investigation on Horn Island itself, just days ago. Key details have come to light: accounts of a heated public confrontation, a claimed sighting of Nolan still alive after 5 p.m., and an attorney's flat insistence that his client's innocence stands at a firm 100%. And they told my friends they were going to kill him, that they wanted to fight. All this crazy stuff. I wasn't there myself, but my friends told me what these people were saying to them was completely out of control. And these two witnesses, two very reliable, very credible, very upstanding members of the community, they saw Nolan, and they've known him for years. There's no chance they got it wrong. Yet the strangest part might be what comes out of the friends' own mouths. Certain statements carry an unmistakable backfire quality, almost as if the very people defending themselves are, in the same breath, handing investigators the material that undermines their own story. I think about this every day. I wish we'd never gone out on the 4th of July, because I know this would have happened. Nolan wouldn't be gone, and, most explosive of all, a clear assessment has now been laid out that this case has already crossed the threshold for arrests. Combined with everything else, that may be enough to justify an arrest warrant at this point. What really happened on Horn Island that 4th of July? Who's been lying? And who's about to be taken into custody? The answers unfold in today's breakdown. To get straight to it, the first round of information released by the group, Warren Hudson, Jack Spitalo, Morgan Seymour, and their lawyer Edward Palcic, centered on the private investigation they carried out on Horn Island a few days earlier. That investigation, led by the people above alongside attorney Tyler Cox, produced a set of findings the group presented as conclusive. Palcic called the visit revelatory and illuminating, pointing out that many people pushing narratives about Nolan Wells' death had never actually set foot on the island. The barrier island itself is long and narrow, shaped by low sand dunes. In the specific area tied to the events of July 4th, there are no trees, barely any foliage, and almost no vegetation at all. The terrain is bare, windswept, and completely exposed. On that holiday, thousands of people were on the island. From these physical conditions, Palcic drew a direct conclusion. A murder committed in broad daylight on such an open, crowded stretch of sand would have been impossible to hide. What some observers want to believe, he argued, simply couldn't happen given the actual geography and the sheer number of witnesses around. That reading of the landscape was then tied to a fixed timeline. According to the young men and their attorney, Morgan, Warren, and Jax left Horn Island around 4:30 p.m. This departure was presented as established fact, not up for debate. At the moment they left, Nolan Wells was still alive. Two members of the Ocean Springs community, described as reliable, credible, and upstanding, later said they saw Nolan at about 10 minutes to 6, nearly an hour and a half after the group had already gone. These witnesses had known Nolan for years. The attorney maintained there was no realistic possibility of misidentification and that the sightings could be backed up by additional evidence and other eyewitness accounts. On that basis, the defense's position was simple. The three men had already left while Nolan was still alive and visible, so they couldn't have had anything to do with whatever caused his death. But that same timeline drew sharp scrutiny from other commentators. Dr. Umar pointed out that the group had arrived around 11:30 a.m. as part of a larger gathering of roughly 30 young people spread across 3 boats, and that their stay lasted only about 5 hours. He questioned why they'd leave so early instead of sticking around until sunset, the more typical pattern for parties on Horn Island. In his view, the shortened window was convenient. He placed the critical period for Nolan's death between 3:30 and 4:30 p.m. and suggested an early departure could have served to remove the Triton group from the pool of potential witnesses or suspects during that stretch of time.
Can you give me some examples of what has happened? Have you guys had things happen online, threats online? Have you guys have any examples of people accosting you or anything like that?
Oh yeah, we have had countless death threats online, been spotted. I'll let you elaborate more on that, being spotted.
I mean, people have obviously just pointed us out. I mean, as a group and even on a one-on-one setting, I think it's really just like awkward because I don't want to talk about this, and I know my friends don't want to talk about this any more than we need to. You know, we're still mourning one of our best friends' death, and it's hard to speak about it when, you know, like sometimes we just need some alone time, or sometimes we just need to, you know, lay back and not be around all this. And I mean, I've been called out in public, and I haven't been in public that much. I know my friends have had encounters in public. The threats have been insane from, you know, my stepmom, my dad, my mom, just everyone included, like even my brothers and my sisters. And it's just hard. I mean, it's unbelievable where like this has been taken to and the level where this is at.
Dr. Umar further insisted that all roughly 30 young people and all 3 boats should be treated as potential crime scenes and subjects of inquiry, not just the Triton and its passengers. Official attention, he noted, appeared focused on a single vessel, while GPS data from the other 2 boats remained unavailable. A separate set of reports introduced yet another sequence of events after 4:30. Nancy Grace's show and investigative reporter Dave Mack circulated social media accounts of a mystery altercation happening around 5 p.m., 30 minutes after the Triton had already left. According to one private message, a husband and wife claimed they saw Nolan arguing with another person, an exchange that included a threat that the other individual would spend the rest of his life in prison. Shortly after, a Bertram boat was seen leaving at high speed. This mystery altercation is being described through social media as something that took place around 5 p.m. that day, 30 minutes after the Triton had already left, and in this account, a Bertram boat was seen pulling away shortly afterward at high speed. This social media conversation claims that a person, one of the passengers, quite possibly Nolan Wells, was part of a group described as almost fighting. Someone reported seeing Nolan with a girl and believed they saw the 2 of them struggling in the water, not necessarily drowning, but struggling, enough that the person watching was clearly concerned. That's from Officer Tatum's show. Cheryl McCollum's take was that it doesn't add up. If a witness genuinely saw 1 or 2 people struggling in the water, wouldn't they try to help? It makes no sense that anyone would watch that unfold, watch to see if someone goes under and doesn't resurface, and just go back to the barbecue. That doesn't track at all. Grace emphasized that this alleged confrontation didn't involve the men who'd brought Nolan to the island on the Triton. If the altercation happened after 4:30, then Nolan was still on Horn Island, embroiled in a serious conflict with someone else. A possibility, she argued, meant investigators needed to look at Nolan and whoever he was arguing with, not just the Triton group. These 3 accounts can't all be true at once. One version holds that the Triton group left at 4:30 with Nolan still alive, and that credible local witnesses saw him unharmed around 5:50. Another treats the 5-hour stay as suspiciously short and places the fatal window between 3:30 and 4:30, suggesting the early departure may have been calculated. A third puts Nolan in an altercation around 5 p.m., after the Triton was gone, with a different boat speeding off afterward. If the 5:50 sightings hold up, the reported 5 p.m. confrontation becomes a major new lead. If the confrontation is real, The claim that Nolan was alive and safe after the Triton left comes under direct pressure. And if the truncated timeline theory is right, both the early exit and the later private island survey could be part of an effort to control the narrative around when and where Nolan was last seen. Palcic described the island as a dynamic marine environment whose physical constraints made the murder theory impossible, and reserved particular criticism for people he called hustlers, profiteers, and liars, those who, in his view, had gained far more attention than they deserved without ever setting foot on the island themselves. After presenting the 550 witnesses, he declared the matter closed on that point, before turning to other aspects of the case. The young men themselves framed the 5-hour stay as unremarkable, though outside observers kept treating the short visit and the missing GPS data from the other boats as unresolved. Beyond the inconsistencies tied to the day of the incident itself, odd details also surfaced in what followed. The young men connected to Nolan Wells presented their initial contact with the Coast Guard and with Christine Wells as deliberate, responsible actions. One member of the group said he'd placed the first call to the Coast Guard the night of the incident and had also been the first to reach Christine Wells to tell her they hadn't heard from her son. The group framed these moves as proactive and correct, insisting they'd handled everything the right way from the start. They also said they had a screenshot of the call attempt to Nolan's mother, offered as proof of both the timing and the content of the conversation. That account runs headfirst into what the family has said. Christine Wells and those close to her have repeatedly questioned both the timing of the contact and how the information was delivered. Analysis tied to Dr. Umar placed the call to the mother closer to 11 p.m., and noted that members of the group had already been in possession of Nolan's phone without disclosing that right away. The contradiction here is stark. One side describes an early, documented notification backed by recorded proof. The other describes a delayed, incomplete communication made while the callers were still holding onto the victim's phone. The interview also included repeated claims of close friendship. Members of the group referred to Nolan as a brother rather than just an acquaintance. One speaker recalled telling Nolan's father, the night he came to his house, that Nolan had been like a brother to him. They described a daily routine of picking Nolan up because he didn't drive, showing up at his driveway without being asked, bringing him along simply because that's what the group did. They insisted the relationship was equal, that Nolan had never been treated differently from anyone else in the circle, and that they'd all stayed together the night before the island trip. These claims of brotherly closeness sit uneasily against what Dr. Umar observed. He pointed out that Nolan seemed to have several simultaneous best friends, including Warren, Tristan, and Javon. In his assessment, Javon, who is black, showed more consistent concern in his public statements, while the relationships with the white members of the group raised unresolved questions. A key point was Christine Wells's own statement that she didn't know the white friends well, despite their claims of friendship going back to 8th grade and of having spent nights at each other's houses. Dr. Umar treated a mother's unfamiliarity with her son's supposed closest friends as a red flag. That contrast leaves the group's talk of brotherhood sitting uneasily next to the gaps in recognition the family has described. The final part of this interview left many unsatisfied, leading them to believe it was little more than a platform for Nolan's friends to vent grievances and promote themselves. They said that after July 4th, the young men described a complete upheaval of daily life, constant vigilance, fear of being recognized in public, fear of physical confrontation or worse. Death threats poured in online, aimed not just at them but at parents, step-parents, and siblings. One concrete incident happened at a restaurant. A woman approached, asked for a name, said the face looked familiar, and asked about their social media. She came back moments later with her phone, showed an earlier interview, and asked if the person on screen was the same one sitting there. The group paid and left. The young men described the restaurant encounter as their first group experience with public confrontation, and framed it as just one instance among many where they or people close to them had been recognized and threatened. Reports of being refused service, like a friend being denied a drink purchase at a convenience store, were cited as further proof of hostility within a community they'd previously described as tight-knit. On the question of race, the group and their attorney pushed back against any racial framing of the death. They argued that media coverage and certain commentators had flipped the nature of the relationship, turning what they called an undifferentiated friendship into a narrative about white young men killing a black young man. They described the original friendship as the very definition of anti-racism, since Nolan had been treated no differently than any other member of the group. Framing the events in racial terms, they argued, was itself wrong and amounted to actually promoting racial division. Attorney Ed Palcic added that outside voices trying to divide Ocean Springs and pit neighbor against neighbor were only compounding the tragedy of the death itself. This stands in direct opposition to Dr. Umar's view, which held that denying any racial dimension served to limit potential federal scrutiny under hate crime statutes, and it also contrasts with early media coverage, which had emphasized racial difference from the first reports. Beyond the substance, the interview itself drew scrutiny over how the questions were structured. Tatum, a former police officer, was seen framing questions in ways that steered the answers rather than opening them up. One notable moment came when the conversation turned to the recorded confrontation. Tatum opened by asking how the young men felt about the enhanced audio, which he himself described as lacking integrity, phrasing that assumed the conclusion and invited agreement rather than genuine explanation. Analysts pointed out the near-total absence of questions meant to create real discomfort. The young men appeared notably at ease with the host, at one point casually referencing Tatum's own past actions by name in a way that suggested familiarity rather than a formal interview. This led to the impression that Tatum was functioning more as the adult managing the room than as an interviewer pushing for clarity, seemingly protecting the narrative the group was putting forward. Much of the airtime went to accounts of post-incident threats, ongoing paranoia, and repeated declarations of total innocence. Meanwhile, the specific contested details, the exact content of the confrontation call, the precise reason the Coast Guard wasn't called sooner, physical details of the island scene, and inconsistencies in the timeline got only brief or vague treatment. The focus stayed on how the young men were being perceived and the hostility aimed at them and their families. One participant referred to Nolan's mother as Miss Wells, a formality that stood out against claims of deep, long-standing friendship. Whenever one of them spoke, the others consistently turned their attention toward him rather than toward the interviewer, a coordinated movement, some described as resembling a single organism checking its alignment. The overall posture came across as defensive, with the primary source of visible stress seeming to be the accusations themselves rather than the unresolved death of the friend they called a brother. No sustained curiosity about what had actually happened on the island came through, an absence some flagged as notable, since only total certainty usually kills the impulse to keep digging. The choice to appear on Tatum's platform became part of the criticism in its own right. Tatum, who left the Tucson Police Department in 2017 and went on to build a career as a conservative commentator affiliated with Turning Point USA and the Blexit movement, has long been a divisive figure within parts of the black community, labeled a sellout by some, and accused of race baiting for consistently defending law enforcement, dismissing claims of systemic racism, and criticizing figures and organizations tied to racial justice causes. In the context of Nolan Wells' death, the quick invitation extended to the white friends and the pushback against racial framing struck critics as consistent with that same pattern. The choice of this particular host, already viewed with suspicion by many of those most actively scrutinizing the young men's accounts, colored how the interview was received before a single statement was even made. Other avenues for direct communication were available. People connected to the group had sizable social media followings and could have posted statements or answered questions directly without going through a host whose objectivity was already in question. Instead, a pattern kept repeating. An appearance would surface a small, often unverified fragment of information, references to witnesses, terrain, or blanket claims of innocence, followed by a stretch of silence, then another appearance with a few more fragments. Each round raised fresh questions about consistency and motive instead of resolving the ones already on the table. Legal representation retained almost immediately after the incident, combined with threats of defamation lawsuits and reliance on a sympathetic outlet, all fed the impression of a coordinated effort to manage public perception. The young men had every right to speak given the documented threats against them and the absence of formal charges, but the manner and venue of their public statements kept drawing as much scrutiny as the statements themselves. The public interviews given by the young men who were with Nolan Wells on Horn Island prompted a series of observations about their demeanor and priorities. Psychotherapist Elliot Connie pointed to the near-complete absence of visible emotion as the group discussed the death of someone they repeatedly called a brother. The loss came up without any of the expected signs of grief. Two things stood out to him. First, the lack of emotion. He noted it would be genuinely hard for him to discuss losing someone supposedly that close without any emotion at all. Second, in the clip that went viral, one of the young men refers to Nolan's mother as Miss Wells rather than by her actual married name, and Connie said he couldn't recall ever not knowing his own close friends' parents' names. Beyond that, he noted how closely people are tracking the details, why a particular call was made, what was said about the boat, how the story shifted, and said that as a psychotherapist, he was paying close attention to their language and body language. What jumped out most to him was that they seemed far more focused on controlling the narrative and managing perception than on pursuing truth or justice for their friend. He called that a major red flag, noting they came across as more defensive than anything else, and that their apparent effort to steer the conversation away from racial implications only added to that sense of defensiveness. There was no expression of curiosity about what had actually caused Nolan's death. Connie observed that typically, only total certainty removes someone's drive to understand what happened, and the total absence of that drive stood out.
When you say you've been called out in public, can you give me an example of like, what do you mean? People are threatening you with weapons? People are, not allowing you, denying you service? Because I heard that Trayston, he went to a corner store and they told him his money is not good there. They wouldn't even let him buy Gatorade.
Yeah.
Are you experiencing things like that or something totally different?
Right. I wouldn't say like that. I think I haven't been denied, anything, but like Trayson, it's hard to hear from a good friend of mine that he's getting denied a Gatorade and a Red Bull before work and having to, like, he calls me and he's like, dude, you won't believe what just happened. He got called out at Walmart. Someone called him out at Walmart and was like asking him all these questions and trying to press him about it. And it's crazy to me. Like, we live in a very tight-knit community, and for people to, push back and say these things when they know what Ocean Springs is like, it's really hard. And I mean, I haven't had many personal encounters, but I know being around the guys and stuff like that, they have, so.
And Ed, as an attorney that's representing these boys, I mean, what does that make you feel like? Do you feel like you got a good case here, or what's your perspective in that? Because people are online, and obviously they know who you are. Obviously they know you represented Donald Trump in some pretty high-profile cases, And so now that you've joined, or at least now you work for the young men here, you hear them say things like they've been accosted, they've been, threatened online. Does that make your case a greater case, or how do you work within what's happening to these young men?
Well, unfortunately, I wish there was no case. I wish this hadn't happened. But unfortunately, because these things did happen, there is a case, and now there's multiple cases. And I'm going to tell you something. If you're out there and you lied about these guys, you lied about my guys, you lied about Tyler's guys here, if you lied about Morgan, if you lied about Jax, if you lied about Warren, we're going to get you. And you're going to be hauled into court, you're going to be held accountable, and it's going to be very painful. And what I would say to the people who have done that is, now's your chance. If you want to apologize and retract before you find yourself in court, you should probably do that now. Because if you don't do that, once you're in court, now you just can't leave. You won't be able to get out of it. And we're not going to name names because there's some other folks who are doing that, and we want to be better than that. And I want to emphasize this, right? We're not here to guess. We're not here to speculate. We're only going to deal in facts, right? And here's the most important thing, right? We don't know how Nolan Wells died. No one here is saying we know. But what we do know is Morgan, Jax, and Warren had nothing whatsoever to do with Nolan Wells' death. And that's what's important. And unfortunately, because there are people who want to divide a town and come in from the outside and tell people what to think and pit neighbor against neighbor, it compounds the tragedy. It magnifies the tragedy. And I just want to say this. Here's why it's an even bigger tragedy. Because my friends here, Morgan, Jax, and Warren, these guys are not just the finest that Ocean Springs has to offer, finest that Mississippi has to offer. These are the finest young men that America has to offer. Really great people. And Tyler actually taught me good Ocean Springs people. That was one of the first things I heard when I got here. So I'll just say that. They're good Ocean Springs people.
The young men made no mention of the pain Nolan's family was going through, no reference to visiting Christine Wells, checking in on her, or sharing in her grief. There were also no personal memories offered, no shared laughter, no specifics about how daily life had changed without their friend. The changes they described were limited entirely to the accusations against them and the threats that followed. Connie's conclusion was that their dominant concern was protecting themselves and shaping public opinion, not supporting the family or seeking clarity about what happened to Nolan. Their composure discussing the island just 2 weeks after the event was seen as unusual, even though tears appearing roughly a month later still fell within the normal range of grief responses. Defensiveness was the most consistent emotional note throughout. The primary stressor seemed to be facing accusations, not the unresolved death itself. Their outright rejection of any racial dimension to the case was characterized as an attempt to frame the question of race as irrational on its face, despite the fact that a black teenager failed to return from an outing with a group of white companions in a region with a well-documented history of unequal justice outcomes. Retaining legal counsel within a day or two of Nolan going missing, along with the willingness to threaten defamation suits, further underscored the emphasis on narrative control. No theory was ever offered about what might have happened to Nolan, despite the fact that the speakers had themselves been on the island. Expressions of regret over having gone to the island on July 4th only surfaced after public commentary had already pointed out their absence, raising the question of whether those later remarks were a response to outside criticism rather than genuine. Carlos Moore, offering a legal perspective, assessed that the publicly available information was already sufficient to support arrest warrants. Asked whether the audio recording alone could justify detention, he said that combined with everything else known, it was enough at this point. Combined with everything else, I think that's enough for an arrest warrant at this point. If I knew everything I know now, and law enforcement brought me a name or names of people they wanted arrested for specific crimes, and laid it all out the way I understand it from what's been publicly disclosed, I wouldn't have any trouble signing an arrest warrant at this stage. And then what happens if we got it wrong? Is there any real consequence for that? What's the actual risk of locking someone up on the conditions just described? It happens all the time. There's no real risk or consequence to the judge or the prosecutor. Law enforcement does its job and does the best it can. The judge would have found probable cause to sign the warrant. Judges have judicial immunity, so they can't be successfully sued for signing one. Prosecutors carry prosecutorial immunity, so it happens constantly. Law enforcement has qualified immunity on top of that. And what we do know is that if the roles were reversed, the black men who came back to shore would almost certainly have been arrested within 24 hours. If law enforcement brought forward specific names, specific charges, and a full factual outline drawn from what's already public, he said he'd have no problem signing one or more warrants. The practical risk of getting it wrong, he pointed out, is minimal. Judges can't be sued for issuing a warrant backed by probable cause. Prosecutors are protected by prosecutorial immunity, officers by qualified immunity, and these decisions happen routinely. He added that had the racial roles been reversed, the black individuals who made it back to shore likely would have been in custody within a day. There had to be more to it for those boys to lawyer up. They have every right to, but as he put it, if a family member of his came to him with an account of something that happened on Horn Island, he'd listen to the facts first as a lawyer, and he wouldn't advise them to lawyer up unless he thought they'd actually committed a crime. You only tell someone to get a lawyer if they might have committed one. If you're simply a witness to a drowning, you can testify freely with zero risk of prison time. So the fact that these boys reportedly lawyered up on July 4th or 5th suggests something may have happened there that carries potential criminal exposure for one or more of them. And then there's the fact that they were seen eating breakfast together at a restaurant on July 5th instead of being out searching for their friend. That's not normal. If any of his friends went missing and he was among the last to see them, he'd be out there with the family, showing them where they'd been, helping search, not sitting down at IHOP or Waffle House. Moore flagged a cluster of early red flags that kept drawing attention. Ashley Cole deactivated her social media almost immediately, citing concern for her children's safety. But as of July 4th, no public threats against those children had actually surfaced yet. The idea that danger would arise purely from a reported drowning was called unsupported and suggestive of something more going on beneath the surface. The group's decision to retain counsel on July 4th or 5th was viewed through a legal lens. Attorneys typically advise clients to get representation only when there's real criminal exposure. A witness to an accidental drowning has essentially no prosecution risk and can speak freely. So securing counsel that quickly implied at least the possibility that someone recognized exposure beyond that of a mere bystander. Their behavior in the days right after the disappearance was scrutinized too. On July 5th, the group was seen having breakfast together instead of joining the search for the person they'd called their best friend. Conduct Moore described as inconsistent with what you'd expect from people who'd been among the last to see him alive. One member gave a media interview on the day of the funeral, still calling Nolan his closest friend, a contrast that raised its own questions about the depth of the concern being shown. Overnight search efforts were also limited. A parent connected to the group said no boat was available for a nighttime return, even though the young men had reached the island by boat themselves, and some vessels were still out on the water as late as 3 a.m. The fact that those boats weren't immediately offered up struck observers as especially troubling. Moore also connected the absence of any detentions, even at the level of basic suspicion, to the intersection of race and socioeconomic status in Mississippi. Several of the young men's parents were identified as holding positions of local influence: dentists, ER physicians, pain management specialists, and at least one judge. He suggested that mix of racial dynamics and family standing could plausibly slow down or alter the normal pace of an investigation. Finally, he returned to the central forensic question: how did Nolan actually enter the water? The pathologist's assessment had already made clear that the manner of entry, voluntary, forced, an accidental push, or an intentional one, would determine both the cause and manner of death. Proving an intentional push from a boat would require witness testimony. Someone, Moore said, knows what happened in those final moments, and everything hinges on that knowledge eventually coming out.
And how confident are you? Because you just met these young men more recently. And are you confident that these young men had nothing to do with it?
Confidence not a strong enough word. In fact, beyond a reasonable doubt is not strong enough. There's a 0% chance that they did anything wrong. So this is not 90%, it's not 99%, it's not 99.9999. There's no decimals, there's no anything. It's 100%, 100.000%, nothing. They did nothing wrong, and that's the problem for our opponents here, who have ruined their lives, dragged them through the mud, and attacked them. You don't get to lie. We have a First Amendment, we love our First Amendment, but you don't get to lie and hurt people. You want to lie and it doesn't hurt people? Fine. You lie and you hurt people, that's why we have defamation. And that's what this is about. So I just want to emphasize this in the strongest possible terms. Zero wrongdoing, completely innocent, totally innocent, and categorically innocent.
Because I'm treating all 30 of those young people and all 3 of those boats as potential crime scenes and as suspects. The call to the Coast Guard, which we'll get into in a minute, happened around 4. It sounds like there was some kind of struggle going on in the background. Nolan could have been losing his life right while that call was being made. He's suggesting Nolan's death wasn't accidental, because he doesn't buy that it was a simple drowning. If Nolan drowned, in his view, he was forced under, not an accident. He was a strong swimmer, and he's not entertaining any other explanation. These claims raise legitimate questions, even if the tone is heated. They sound extreme, almost inflammatory, yet they might account for a lot of the strange, unresolved details in this case. Still, statements alone aren't proof. What matters is evidence. What specific points lead him to rule out an accident? What actually happened to Nolan Wells on that island, and according to Dr. Umar, who's really responsible? That said, this may only be the visible edge of something much bigger. Have you noticed how the circumstances of Nolan's death keep circling back to the same uncomfortable questions? Is this an isolated tragedy, or something with a broader, even repeating, pattern? He compared it to how gangs operate, noting that from what he understands through law enforcement contacts, there's typically some form of initiation involved. So he said he'd want to explore whether this connected to initiation into some kind of white supremacist group, whether it had any parallel to cases like Carmelo Anthony, Austin Metcalf, or the RDL case out of Texas, or whether it was simply an accident or someone who got drunk and overreacted. Among the central suspicions in the Nolan Wells case, the question of who's lying looms largest, and Nolan's friends, along with the closeness they claimed, sit at the heart of it. According to Warren Hudson's account, given in his interview with Officer Brandon Tatum, roughly 30 young people, most of them white, headed to Horn Island on the morning of July 4, 2026, across 3 boats. They left between 8 and 9 a.m. and arrived around 11:30 a.m., with the 3 boats functioning as one group. Dr. Umar has consistently argued that all 30 people and all 3 boats should have been treated as potential crime scenes and potential suspects. Narrowing the investigation down to Warren's boat, a 22-foot Triton nicknamed Big Daddy, while setting the other 2 aside, left a significant gap. Neither the Jackson County Sheriff's Office nor the District Attorney's Office has clarified whether all 3 boats returned together, and the Cajun Navy later confirmed it has no GPS data for the other 2 vessels. Dr. Umar has asked outright who made the call to exclude those 2 boats, and the roughly 20 people on them, calling the decision itself suspicious. In his words, he's treating all 30 of those young people and all 3 boats as crime scenes and suspects. All 3 boats are potential crime scenes. All 30 youths are potential suspects. He said he doesn't understand why Jackson County Sheriff Ledbetter or District Attorney Moran decided to separate Warren's boat, the one Nolan was on, from the other 2 for the purposes of the investigation, since all 3 boats operated as a unit, and it's never been clarified whether they returned together as one. In his view, all 30 young people and all 3 boats should have been part of this investigation, not just the single vessel. That, he said, is his first major problem with the case. Who decided to carve out the other 2 boats and roughly 20 people, especially given that the Cajun Navy has confirmed it has no GPS data on either of them? The claims of close friendship around Nolan have drawn just as much scrutiny. Warren described himself as Nolan's best friend and called him a brother. Tristan has been described the same way, and Javen, who is black, has also been named as a best friend. Dr. Umar has flagged the unusual number of best friend labels attached to one 18-year-old, especially since Javon's own comments suggested he didn't regularly spend time with Warren's circle. Christine, Nolan's mother, has said she didn't know the White friends and that the group had never been to Nolan's home. Their only overnight stay together was the night of July 3rd, right before the trip. Dr. Umar has asked who, if anyone, ever actually heard Nolan himself refer to Warren or Tristan as his best friend, and he's described Javon as the more credible of the claimants, pointing to Javon's measured comments on TMZ as reflecting genuine concern rather than an attempt to distance himself. Javon, for his part, said Nolan spent a lot of time with that group, but he personally didn't. They were older, back from college, and Nolan hung around them more than he did. He said he knew them but wasn't part of their regular hangouts, that one of them seemed like a solid guy, but he couldn't speak to what their get-togethers were actually like since he was never there himself. Nolan would just tell him they'd had a good time or that they were heading out somewhere, and he never said anything negative about them. He estimated maybe 100 people were out at Horn Island that day, essentially everyone from the coast who usually goes, mostly older. He said he arrived around 11 and walked down to their boat, where he found a much bigger crowd than he expected. Dr. Umar said he has trouble with the 3 best friends narrative. At 18, he noted, you might have 1 close friend, maybe 2, and if you run in a pack, sure, maybe 3.
And you guys have had experiences with either people threatening you online. I know that, Warren, we talked about this before, and we talked a little, or at least spoke a little bit about when you go out, you guys are getting accosted by people. Can you give us an example of, or at least tell the audience an example of an incident where you guys may have been accosted, or what does that look like when you go out? People threaten you with weapons, or people trying to physically harm you, or people having to be restrained? What kind of engagement is happening when you guys go out?
We went to a restaurant, a couple of buddies of mine, and when we were, I wouldn't say threatening with weapons or anything, but I felt, and I know my friends felt, threat for our lives. I mean, I don't think there was like a fear factor, but at the same time, like it's awkward in public, like I stated, like when we have to talk about these things. But we went to a restaurant and someone came up to me and was like, "Is this you?" And I was kind of like shaken up about it. Well, at first she asked like my name and, you know, like all these questions, and I was like, okay, whatever, you know, she's just coming up to talk. Well, then she came up to me again and showed me our first interview and was like, "Are you sure this isn't you?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, that's me, like obviously." And she she kind of just, I looked at my buddy and I was like, yeah, we're leaving, like close everything out, like we're going. And I left, and there was an altercation after I left with some of my buddies that weren't involved in this at all. And they told my friends that they were gonna kill them and they wanted to fight and all this like crazy stuff. I mean, I wasn't there, but my friends told me this, that what the people were saying to them was like totally just crazy. Like, I mean, there was people like that were, you know, outside of this telling us like, hey, you need to leave before something happens because I know what could go down right now. And like, I know that these people are crazy. So, I mean, we all felt, we were kind of shaken up about that. It was weird because it was our first encounter as a group. And I think it's also like just crazy that people will like look at you in the eye and tell you they'll kill you because they believe you killed your best friend and you have nothing to do with it.
And Morgan and Jax, were you guys there?
Yes, we were there.
I was there.
I didn't hear the part where they said they were gonna kill him and stuff, but I did hear whenever she came up to him originally, she was like, "Hey, you have like TikTok or anything like that? Your face looks really familiar." And he was like, "No, I don't have TikTok or anything like that." And she was like, "Oh, okay," and then walked off, and then came back with, like you said, the first interview, on her phone. And showing him, she's like, "So this isn't you. Either you have a doppelganger or this is you." And he was like, "Well, yeah, that's me." And then we got the check and we bounced and we were waiting outside for everybody else to get out of there. And while we're waiting outside is whenever some of our other buddies that aren't even on social media that we were just there with was getting told that other people were going to kill them and all that kind of stuff.
So how did that make you guys feel did you think they were serious? Did you think it was just people trying to make a name for themselves by confronting you in front of others? Like, what was your take on that, Morgan?
I think it was just like, I was in the general area of where one of our buddies was, where this altercation happened. And I actually got into a conversation with a fellow next to me that wasn't even involved. And he told me straight up, he was like, "If I was y'all right now, I would leave before y'all get hurt. Y'all need to leave right now. I'm just watching out for y'all and making sure y'all are safe." And I mean, I wouldn't say that those people would have physically done something in that moment, but I think they were playing like almost like a mental game, like just to get into your head and just almost like make yourself like just think these things that obviously are not true.
But by Javon's own account, he said, Javon didn't spend much time with the other two. It sounded more like Javon and Nolan mostly hung out one-on-one, not as part of a foursome with Tristan and Warren. So, if there really were 3 or 4 best friends, they'd typically travel as a group. And that doesn't match what Javon described. Umar said he's not claiming it's impossible for all of them to be best friends, just that it seems unlikely. Carlos Moore, drawing on his experience evaluating testimony, has zeroed in on behavior that doesn't line up with what you'd expect from genuinely close friends. The group left Nolan on the island without his phone or keys. If he'd truly said he planned to stay behind with Katie, Moore argued, either he would have grabbed his phone before they left, or his friends would have made sure he had it. Instead, they didn't contact his mother until around 11 p.m., more than 6 hours after leaving the island around 4:30 p.m. Moore called that gap excessive if real concern had existed. The same friends deactivated their social media and got lawyers early on, while Katie, the young woman central to their alibi, didn't initially retain counsel. Moore noted that ordinary witnesses to an accidental drowning rarely show that kind of immediate defensiveness. A lot of people are pointing fingers at the friends. From your professional standpoint, what makes them look guilty? I wouldn't say guilty exactly, but it definitely makes them look suspicious. These friends aren't behaving the way friends typically do. For one thing, if you leave a friend behind, you'd know exactly who they stayed with. And from the very start, the accounts have conflicted. The young woman is allegedly named Katie, and Sheila says Nolan told her he was heading back with the friends he came with. but those same friends say he stayed behind with Katie. Both versions can't be true, and what we do know is Katie didn't lawyer up right away. She may still not have, while the so-called friends reportedly retained counsel almost immediately and deactivated or scrubbed some of their social media early on. That's suspicious. Why do that if you weren't expecting any scrutiny? People drown every year. If you're just a witness, there's no reason to be that anxious or on edge. A lot happened as this unfolded, plenty of it suspicious, and a few points stand out. First, his phone and keys weren't on him. What's your read on that? On its own, it's not damning. If you're out on the water, you'd naturally leave your phone somewhere dry, inside the boat. What makes it suspicious is that if he'd really told them he was staying on the island with a young woman, he'd have gone back for his phone. You always know when you don't have it on you, and that's usually the first thing you go retrieve. Or his friends, remembering he didn't have it, would have brought it to him before pulling away. Or at the very least, handed it straight to his mother the moment they got back to shore if they'd simply forgotten. Warren's further statements have only deepened the questions. He confirmed the group spent the night of July 3rd under the same roof as Nolan. Dr. Umar has pointed to the contradiction between calling Nolan a brother and best friend one night, then leaving him stranded without phone or keys the very next afternoon. When Warren called Christine around 11 p.m. to ask if she'd heard from her son, he was already holding Nolan's phone and never mentioned it. After Christine and Javan's mother, Tashima, used Life 360 to track the phone to a residence, roughly 15 minutes passed before it was handed over. A gap Dr. Umar has suggested may have been used to delete Nolan's Snapchat and align their stories. Warren and others later launched an online fundraiser that brought in roughly $160,000 and hired an attorney previously tied to Donald Trump, despite no arrests, indictments, or charges having been filed. Dr. Umar has asked why any of that would be necessary for people who maintain they're innocent. Javan's separate account further undercuts the collective best friend narrative. He said he spent most of his time with Nolan one-on-one, not with Warren and Tristan, which doesn't support the idea that the whole group shared equally close bonds. Carlos Moore noted that as a judge, he had to weigh testimony from both sides in real time and rule based on what was more credible, what had actually been shown beyond reasonable doubt. He added that leaving Nolan without any clear way home is hard to square with the claim that he'd planned to stay at a friend's house afterward. Departure times themselves have shifted across different statements. Some say around 4:30 p.m., others closer to 5 or earlier. In his experience, when people closely tied to the same events give shifting timelines, that usually points to adjustment rather than honest error. The early lawyering up and social media scrubbing by the group, contrasted with Katie's initial lack of legal representation, creates a clear gap in how much self-protection each side displayed. A gap Moore called inconsistent with how uninvolved witnesses to an ordinary drowning tend to behave. As earlier accounts have shown, the unusually long, unexplained gaps in the timeline remain a central focus, and the questions extend beyond Nolan's friends to Katie herself, described as the last person to speak with him. The group left the mainland the morning of July 4th and reached Horn Island around 11:30 a.m. According to Warren and the others, they decided to leave between 4 and 4:30 p.m., putting their total time on the island at roughly 5 hours. An unusually early departure, Dr. Umar has noted, compared to the more typical pattern of staying until evening or after sunset. She said her conversation with Nolan happened sometime between 3 and 4:30. That window is noticeably broader than anyone else's. Javan's, by comparison, is much narrower. He said he saw Nolan around 3:40, stepped away to deal with something else, and by the time he returned, they were already gone. Katie puts her exchange with him somewhere between 3 and 4:30, and Dr. Umar's theory is that she's deliberately keeping that range wide, giving Warren and the others space to align their accounts. As for Christine, and he genuinely feels for her, she'd heard from a coach who'd also crossed paths with Nolan on the island, and that coach placed his conversation with Nolan between 2:30 and 3:30. So, Javon's last sighting was 3:40. The coach spoke with him between 2:30 and 3:30, and Katie's window ran from 3 to 4:30. Stacking those together, Dr. Umar's takeaway is that Nolan most likely died somewhere in that 3:30 to 4:30 stretch. 3 distinct accounts mark the final reported sightings of Nolan alive. A coach who later contacted Nolan's mother said his conversation with Nolan fell between 2:30 and 3:30 p.m. and confirmed Nolan wasn't intoxicated at the time, directly undercutting earlier claims that he'd been drinking heavily and wandered into the water on his own. Javon says he saw Nolan around 3:40 p.m. before stepping away to check on another friend on a different boat. By the time he returned, both Nolan and Warren's boat had left. And according to Katie's sister, Katie's conversation with Nolan took place sometime between 3 and 4:30 p.m. Putting all three together, Dr. Umar has concluded that the most probable window for harm sits between 3:30 and 4:30 p.m., with the emergency call placed around 4 p.m., landing right in the center of that range. His theory is that Nolan's death wasn't accidental, since he doesn't buy the idea of a simple drowning. If Nolan did drown, in Umar's reading he was forced under, not lost by accident. Nolan was a strong swimmer, and Umar isn't giving weight to the idea that he simply went under on his own. A drowning, in his view, would have to have been forced. So by his account, Katie, the coach, and Javon are arguably the last three people to have seen Nolan alive, apart, of course, from whoever else was on the boat when it happened. That's his stated position. And it's worth noting that all three of those final sightings cluster right around 3:30, just before the emergency call went out at 4 p.m. Javon says he left at 3:40, the coach at 3:30, and the call itself came in at 4. Within that call, which we'll get to shortly, there's what sounds like a struggle happening in the background. Umar's theory is that Nolan may have been losing his life, or being choked, at the exact moment that call was placed. So again, his conclusion is that Nolan's death occurred sometime within that 3:30 to 4:30 window. The biggest inconsistency centers on Katie's account.
If you can go back to the very beginning of this, how do you think this should have played out? Because I always question in my mind that when I go back, I look at what happened, I look at the initial stories with Nolan, and you guys knew him, right? I didn't know him. I know none of you guys. I just had a chance to meet you guys more recently. But how do you think this should have gone? If you could control the environment, Nolan is found deceased. How do you guys think that this should have been put out to the world?
So first off, I wish that none of this would ever happen. I wish Nolan could still be here with us today. And I wish that, like I said, none of this would ever happen. Like, I wish that all this could be erased and Nolan could be here tomorrow. I mean, that's more than anything. But other than that, I feel like his mom blasting us on social media from the get-go, saying that he was out there with Warren and another guy. That's where it first started to take off. And then also the fact that she posted a picture of me and Morgan and another guy and Nolan on the boat together, blasting that out there, pushing this narrative, kind of, I guess. I wish that would have never happened either. And I don't think those would have never happened, a lot of this stuff wouldn't have been as viral or gone all over the country at this point. I mean, this is a countrywide news story that is just blown out of proportion. And the fact that it was our best friend and it's not what people are saying it is what hurts the most. I mean, that was our brother. I mean, straight up. That's what I told his dad the night that he came over to my house. He was like, blah, blah, saying something. I was like, dude, that was my brother. Like, and you know that. He knows that. We were picking him up every single day. He never drove. I can't tell you how many times I pulled up in his driveway and picked him up. And it wasn't him asking. It was just because that's what we did. We just picked up Nolan all the time. That's how we, came about to all the stuff that we were going to. We'd go and pick him up. That's how much we like to be around him. We would do stuff like that all the time,
Well, first off, like I wish we would have never, like I think about this every day. Like I wish we would have never went out on the 4th of July, because I know this wouldn't have happened. Nolan wouldn't be gone. And like it's really hard to think about, because it's like, I wish I would have done this different, or I wish I would have done that different, because now one of my brothers wanted to be, like, passed away. But I think from the beginning, I'm glad that I called the Coast Guard, and I'm glad that we came together as a group, even from the first day when people started texting us things, saying, crazy things. But I wish it wouldn't have been reported as some type of race thing. I think it's really bad that, like, people are pushing the narrative, oh, this is a race thing. Well, obviously it's not. I mean,
Warren and the other friends maintain that Nolan told them he'd stay behind to talk with Katie and that they should leave without him. Katie's sister has said Katie denies that conversation ever took place. According to her, Nolan actually told Katie he needed to get back to the boat because his friends were about to leave. Javon has separately disputed the friends' version as well, saying Nolan wasn't the type to send his friends off so he could stay behind with a girl he'd just met. Dr. Umar sees two possible reasons behind the group's Katie narrative. It builds an alibi that shifts responsibility away from Warren's boat, and it widens the final sighting window enough that the friends aren't as clearly positioned as the last people with Nolan. He's also raised the possibility that Javon, Katie, and the coach may have each nudged their reported times slightly earlier than what actually happened, effectively placing themselves outside the window when a homicide could have occurred. He's been careful to note he's not accusing any of the three of involvement in the death itself, but he's flagged the convenient clustering of their cutoff times, all landing around 3:30 to 3:40 p.m., as something worth closer scrutiny. Since their windows overlap, yet none of them report seeing each other, that means at least one account has to be off. The emergency call itself came in around 4 p.m., squarely inside the window Umar considers critical, and he's raised the possibility that Nolan was being harmed while that call was in progress. A reading, he says, is supported by background audio later reviewed by an independent audio engineer. Katie's reported window, 3 to 4:30 p.m., is noticeably wider than Javin's, or the coach's, and Umar has questioned whether that breadth was deliberate, giving the group more room to align their stories. In his words, he's not throwing shade at Javin, who he likes, nor at Katie McCormick, who he doesn't know, nor at the coach. But he wants to understand why all three landed on roughly the same cutoff despite apparently not seeing each other, asking whether, intentionally or not, they're each placing themselves just outside the window during which the alleged crime occurred. He noted it's striking that all three report their last sighting right around 3:30, Javon at 3:40, the coach around 3:30, and that if none of them actually crossed paths during these separate conversations with Nolan, it raises the question of whether they've each pushed their timeline early enough to stay clear of the investigation as a witness. To be clear, he said, he doesn't think Javon had anything to do with what happened. He's confident of that, but he's asking whether Javon might be reporting an earlier sighting than what actually occurred, simply to remain outside the scope of the investigation. He said he doesn't think Katie had anything to do with the crime either, but asked whether she might be placing her conversation with Nolan slightly earlier than it actually happened, to avoid being drawn in as a witness. Same question for the coach. Could he be shifting the timing of his own conversation for the same reason? The earlier claim that Nolan was intoxicated and wandered into the water on his own was already undercut by the coach, confirming Nolan was sober between 2:30 and 3:30 p.m. Dr. Umar has characterized that original narrative as an early push to steer public perception toward an accidental drowning. Carlos Moore has zeroed in on the 6.5-hour gap between the reported 4:30 p.m. departure and the roughly 11 p.m. call to Nolan's mother. Drawing on his experience evaluating testimony, he said that stretch of time is more than enough to delete messages, Snapchat accounts, and phone histories, coordinate or adjust statements within the group, and deal with Nolan's phone and keys. In his words, there are a lot of hours between 4:30 and 11 p.m., and he doesn't understand the delay in calling Miss Wells. That gap stood out to him as potentially supporting the idea that something was unfolding during that window, deletions, coordination, while the actual events remain unknown. He's also flagged inconsistencies in the early timeline as suspicious. He's willing to extend some benefit of the doubt here, but noted that Warren's biological mother said the group left around 5, based on a DM covered earlier, while his stepmother placed the departure closer to 3:30 or 4:30. Moore has also pointed out that Nolan was found in roughly the same area where the boat had been docked and where he was last seen, even though searchers had already combed that exact area the day before and turned up nothing. He's characterized that as potentially suggestive of the body being placed there later, rather than simply drifting there naturally. He's further noted that, aside from the emergency call itself, there's no independent evidence the Triton was actually taking on water or sinking, a conclusion that lines up with the Cajun Navy's own review, which undercuts the stated justification for both the early departure and the emergency call. After that call, a family member reportedly contacted the captain directly and was told the group was fine. Communication Moore has called inconsistent with a boat in genuine distress. He's also flagged the minor discrepancies in reported departure times, some around 4:30, others closer to 5 or earlier, noting that when people closely tied to the same event give shifting times for the same moment, that pattern more often points to adjustment than to honest memory error. Before moving into more contested territory like possible motive, the focus stays for now on the single most significant piece of evidence to surface in recent days, the emergency call itself, sometimes referred to as the Sea Tow or Towboat US call, placed at roughly 4 p.m. That timing falls right inside the window Dr. Umar considers most likely for when Nolan was harmed, between 3:30 and 4:30 p.m. He's characterized the call as functioning primarily as an alibi or a diversion. If the time of death were later fixed near 4 p.m., the people on the boat could argue they were dealing with a sinking vessel and therefore couldn't have been involved. But an independent review by the Cajun Navy found no objective evidence the Triton was taking on water or had sustained any damage, and aside from the call itself, nothing else supports a mechanical emergency. When the dispatcher offered to loop in the Coast Guard, the caller declined, a refusal Umar has called inconsistent with a genuine life-threatening situation involving a sinking boat, since a crew in real danger would typically welcome any help available. He's also pointed to internal contradictions within the call itself. When asked about water depth, the caller first said 17 feet, then corrected it to 31. He calls the dispatcher and, paraphrasing here, says their boat is sinking and they need a tow. She asks how deep the water is. He says 17 feet, then immediately corrects himself to 31. That's a huge gap between the two figures. And the question is, why wouldn't you know which one is accurate? These are people who boat constantly, who head out to Horn Island all the time. How do you not know whether you're sitting in 17 feet of water or 31? It gets stranger from there. The dispatcher asks if he wants the Coast Guard called, and he says no, they don't need them. If your boat is genuinely sinking in 31 feet of water, why turn down help? You'd want whoever could get there fastest. Declining the Coast Guard in that scenario doesn't add up. Asked how many adults were aboard, the caller said none. Asked for a total head count, he first said everyone was under 21, then eventually settled on, like 7. The boat had left that morning with 8 people, 7 white teens and Nolan. Dr. Umar has pointed to that hedge, like 7 instead of a clean 7, as suggestive of hesitation, possibly because the caller wasn't sure at that moment whether Nolan was still alive. His reasoning, if it were simply 7 people on a boat, there'd be no need to round or soften the number. You'd just say 7. The vagueness, in Umar's view, points to someone avoiding a direct count because the true number should have been 8, and naming 7 invites the obvious follow-up question of where the 8th person was. The dispatcher's own questions were unusual too. She asked whether anyone on board was breathing and whether anyone was alive. Umar has suggested she may have picked up on something odd in the background prompting those questions. An independent audio engineer, later identified as Jeanette or Jacqueline Brenly, cleaned up the recording without AI assistance, and in the enhanced version, background voices become audible, including phrases reported as, "Is he still alive?" "Did you unalive him?" "Is he okay?" and "Is he still breathing?" Umar has said that if those phrases are verified, everyone across all 3 boats would need to be investigated and could potentially face charges at varying levels, as principals, accomplices, or accessories after the fact. Carlos Moore has focused on the technical inconsistencies and the broader pattern of atypical responses. Experienced boaters familiar with the waters around Horn Island wouldn't normally mix up depths as different as 17 and 31 feet. And declining Coast Guard help is difficult to square with a boat genuinely taking on water and putting lives at risk. Most people in that situation would want the fastest, most qualified help available, and as much of it as possible. Asked about the Cajun Navy's report, Moore said what stood out to him was their finding that there's no proof the Triton was actually taking on water, nothing beyond the call itself. He also found it suspicious that they called for a tow rather than the Coast Guard, and then explicitly turned down Coast Guard help when it was offered. Not a typical response for a boat supposedly sinking with lives supposedly at risk. After that call ended, a family member, described as a grandfather or other relative, placed a separate call directly to the captain and was told the group was fine. Moore has flagged that follow-up as another irregularity. On the background audio specifically, Moore explained that on first listen, the main exchange came through clearly, but the background chatter was faint and hard to make out. Once the recording was cleaned up without AI, the secondary voices became clearer and left a stronger impression that something violent or acutely urgent may have been happening while the call was underway. Moore's overall conclusion is that if this were a straightforward accidental drowning, the level of early defensiveness, immediate lawyering up, deactivated social media, and a string of contradictory statements wouldn't have an obvious explanation. The timing of the call, the absence of corroborating evidence of mechanical failure, the refusal of Coast Guard help, the shifting answers on depth and head count, the dispatcher's unusual questions, the cleaned-up background audio, and the later "we're good" call to the captain all form a connected set of unresolved issues around this recording, each weighed against the reported 3:30 to 4:30 p.m. window and a claim that the boat was ever genuinely in distress. These discrepancies remain central to the open questions surrounding Nolan's final hours on Horn Island.
I wish that would have been completely different. I'm glad I called the Coast Guard. I'm glad I made the first contact within all of this. I'm glad I was the first one that called Christine Wells that night and told her that we haven't heard from her son. And I'm glad that I did all of that, but I hate the way this has been perceived by the media and portrayed. This has been absolutely horrible with the way and the things that they've said to us. and done. But other than that, I mean, there's not much I would change from my point of view and my friend's point of view. I think we did everything right, and I know we did nothing wrong.
I also want to say, I think it's so criminal that they took something so anti-racist and flipped it into something super racist. Like they took, this is the definition of anti-racism. I mean, that we did not look at Nolan any different than I looked at him, or even you. You know, this is literally our brother. I mean, like we stated, we did not treat him any different. We didn't treat Tristan any different. We don't treat Tristan any different. And they just flipped it. And I just think that is so wild that they're pushing this thing that they're saying, oh, they want to end racism and all this stuff. Well, they're the one pushing it. They're pushing the racism. And I just think that's kind of crazy.
Morgan, what's your thoughts on this? How does it affect you?
I mean, first I want to say wish this would have never happened. I wish Nolan would still be here with us today. And but in my opinion, I think that the media, they shouldn't have pushed a narrative from so early. I think that they should have let the local officials do their job, let them release statements, and then, I mean, the media is obviously going to see that and then do whatever they do. But that's what I mean. I trust the local officials.
Ed, with what has transpired, you know, how does that dictate your response? Because you have a 30,000 foot view of all of this stuff, right? You see the way that it could have went, and you see that there's people that instigated the narrative that's out there now. And as a defamation attorney, how does this navigate your tactics?
Sure, and I want to be clear about something. Tonight, I'm not going to give any particular person any more oxygen than they may have already sucked up. But I will say this. What's been said about Morgan, Jax, and Warren, I'm not going to call them untruths or half-truths or falsehoods. I'm going to call it what it is, lies.
Turning now to a subject likely to prove contentious, the range of possible motives should Nolan's death ultimately be ruled a homicide. To be clear, everything that follows is speculative. Professional assessments offered by observers based on available information, not an accusation against any specific individual, and should be read with that caveat in mind. Former Judge Carlos Moore has laid out several possible, non-exclusive motives. One centers on sudden rage brought on by alcohol or drugs. Under the influence, some people shift into markedly different versions of themselves and can respond with unexpected violence. Whaley reports had claimed Nolan himself had been drinking heavily, but that was undercut by the coach, who spoke with him between roughly 2:30 and 3:30 p.m. and confirmed he wasn't intoxicated. That confirmation has mainly served to challenge the accidental drowning narrative, rather than to establish a substance-driven motive on anyone else's part. If this does turn out to be a crime, there has to be some motive behind it. That's typically how these things work. There's a reason someone does something. So from a personal standpoint, what's the likely motive? Why isn't Nolan still with us? A few things could be at play. It could have been alcohol-fueled rage. Some people become markedly different versions of themselves once they've been drinking or using certain substances, and something could have unfolded where people lost control and reacted violently toward Nolan. A second line of thinking centers on an interracial confrontation reportedly on the island. Accounts describe an argument between Tristan, a friend of Nolan's, described as biracial, and Tristan's white girlfriend, during which a white teen stepped in, told Tristan not to speak to her that way, and threw the first punch. Carlos Moore has said the racial dimension of that exchange can't be brushed aside. In certain settings, a black or biracial man, in a heated argument with a white woman, has historically drawn disproportionate reactions. Since Tristan and Nolan spent nearly the entire day together, Moore has reasoned that any anger directed at Tristan could easily have carried over onto Nolan simply by association. There was apparently a fight, and it's gotten surprisingly little discussion, which stands out because, from what's been reported, Tristan Shepard, who's biracial and a friend of Nolan's, had his white girlfriend there, and the two of them were arguing when a young white man stepped in and essentially told Tristan not to speak to her that way. Looking at that, it's hard to ignore the racial undertone. Was the anger really about a black man being with a white woman? If someone's simply asserting himself a bit in his own relationship and isn't putting hands on anyone, most people would stay out of it. Couples have their moments. But the fact that this particular man escalated to violence first, according to the report, is what's alarming. What would push someone to react that strongly? Given that Tristan and Nolan were together most of the day, and Tristan is the one who set someone off, anyone who resembled him on that island, anyone black or biracial, could have become a target by association, since the two were known to be friends. A third possibility involves the idea of retaliation, tied to a broader regional pattern. Moore has pointed to the earlier case in Texas involving Carmelo Anthony and Austin Metcalf. Some observers have floated the possibility that Nolan's disappearance on July 4th, alongside other disappearances of young black men with similar profiles around the same period, could form part of a larger pattern. Though Moore has framed this strictly as a line worth investigating, not an established connection. No direct evidence ties the Texas case to what happened on Horn Island. There's been other suspicious activity nationally as well. The Carmelo Anthony, Austin Metcalf case in Texas was highly controversial, and some believe Nolan's case could be retaliation tied to it. That angle warrants examination, given that several young men disappeared around the same time with similar demographics to Nolan, at a moment when open racism has become more socially tolerated again in parts of the country, something Moore called genuinely troubling. He stressed the need to consider every possible motive, not just one or two. It could be accidental, something specific to Horn Island, or something more deliberate connected to events elsewhere, like Texas. Dr. Umar has placed the heaviest emphasis on the racial framing of the case. He's been sharply critical of public statements from Nolan's stepfather, Elmore, and Coach Tracy, both of whom said they didn't believe race played any role. Comments Umar argues inadvertently lower the odds that federal prosecutors would pursue charges under the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, which carries a potential life sentence. He's also pointed to the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, which allows for up to 30 years when multiple people are involved, and Mississippi's Accessory After the Fact statute, which carries up to 20 years for anyone who helps conceal a crime. Nolan was the only black person among roughly 30 teens spread across the three boats, and Umar has argued that ruling out race as a factor this early is both premature and conveniently advantageous for any future defendants. He's consistently framed the case within the legal categories of hate crime and, should multiple participants be confirmed, lynching, drawing a direct historical parallel to Emmett Till's murder in Mississippi in 1955, roughly 70 years, or 2 to 3 generations earlier.
So the first thing that's really important here is we're dealing with lies and liars. We're dealing with profiteers. We're dealing with hustlers. And one thing that I've seen since I got here is that Ocean Springs, Mississippi, is a really beautiful place. And the region is very beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful places in the country. And there is just no question, the death of Nolan Wells is a horrendous tragedy. But for the tragedy to then be magnified after his death for no reason other than profit is a disgrace, or what we would call a shanda. And I had the opportunity to go to Horn Island today with Tyler and Warren and Jax. And a lot of people who have been sucking up way more oxygen than they're entitled to have not been to the island. I'm willing to bet that a lot of the hustlers and profiteers and liars have not been to that island. And you have to go to that island. And being at the island today was revelatory. It was really illuminating. It's a very dynamic marine environment, first of all. But when you go to the island, you see instantly that what some people want to be true, what they wish to be true, they're trying to wish it to be true. They're trying to make it true through their lies. It's actually not possible. It is a very, very long and narrow barrier island. It's basically very low sand dunes. And in the particular part of the island that we're dealing with, there are no trees. It's hardly any foliage, hardly any tree cover, hardly any plants, and it's wide open. And on July 4th, there were thousands of people there. There is no possible way that anybody could have committed a murder in broad daylight on a barren, windswept island that is narrow and was just swamped with people that day in broad daylight. It's just not possible given the natural environment there. And that leads me to the next point, which is this. Once you know what the timeline is, when you combine the timeline with the actual dynamics of the island itself, all of the lies completely unravel because it isn't possible, and here's why. Morgan, Warren, and Jax left the island at about 4:30 p.m. That's it. They were gone. That is not open for debate. So that's a fact. They were gone. And at that time, Nolan Wells was still alive. Now, I'm not going to name them out of respect for their privacy, but just as one example, there are two very fine, upstanding members of the Ocean Springs community who saw Nolan.
He's invoked the idea that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, suggesting attitudes capable of producing that kind of violence can persist across generations, not as proof about any one individual, but as a reminder of the region's documented history, which he argues any claim that race is irrelevant here has to be measured against. Carlos Moore has agreed that race can't be dismissed, returning repeatedly to the island altercation. A white teenager chose to insert himself into a verbal argument between a biracial man and a white woman and escalated straight to physical violence, with nothing to suggest Tristan ever struck the woman. Moore sees the willingness to bring violence into what was a purely verbal dispute as a meaningful sign of heightened reactivity, and given that Tristan and Nolan were together most of the day, any lingering hostility toward Tristan could plausibly have extended to Nolan without further provocation. None of these motive theories has been confirmed by charging documents or forensic findings. Each remains an interpretive framework built from available statements, the group's demographics, the sequence of the island altercation, the region's history of racial violence, and the coincidental timing of other unresolved disappearances. The intoxication theory has already been undercut by the coach's contemporaneous account that Nolan was sober mid-afternoon. The retaliation and initiation theories rest on pattern recognition rather than direct evidence. And the racial theory rests on Nolan being the only black person present, the interracial confrontation that preceded his final hours, the public downplaying of race by family members and a coach, and the legal consequences tied to a formal hate crime designation. Together, these form the current range of motive theories in circulation.